All right, everybody. Welcome to the Civil War Direct Causes Part 2. Last time we finished up, we spoke about a number of different topics, including the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the unfolding of events which led to what we call Bleeding Kansas. Now, I mentioned in the last lecture that in some ways this is sort of the opening chapter to the Civil War, and to a degree, the Kansas-Nebraska Act sort of made the Civil War inevitable. And I say that not because, in fact, it was inevitable, but it definitely played a significant role in bringing about the conflict, in large measure because the violence that erupted reflected the tensions and the division that were, prior to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, just debated about and spoken about. Now those divisions are finding action, and that action was violent, and it's going to continue on. Okay, and so that's what we're going to do here today. What we're going to do is we're going to look at some additional major events that transpired during the 1850s, and we will start ourselves a war here today. And so we're going to be looking at a number of just different topics and different things, most of them, again, having to do with slavery, its westward expansion, among other things. And so with that, let's go ahead and dive right into this. And we are going to do, the first thing we're going to do, rather, is we're going to take a look at a novel written by Harriet Beecher Stowe called Uncle Tom's Cabin. Let's move on. Now, the lady you see here on the right, that is Harriet Beecher Stowe. She came from a fairly prominent family. Specifically for her father's namesake, whose name was Lyman Beecher. Lyman Beecher was probably the most well-respected and perhaps well-known preacher during the 19th century. And Harriet Beecher Stowe, however, becomes a celebrity in her own right as she publishes Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now, during the 19th century, Uncle Tom's Cabin was the second best-selling book throughout the 19th century, second only to the Bible, and it is to this day still the second most translated work next to the Bible. So her text, Uncle Tom's Cabin, did a significant thing. It significantly contributed to the coming of the Civil War. In fact, at one time, Abraham Lincoln is said to have met Harriet Beecher Stowe during the war and said something to the effect of, "You're the little old lady that started this grand old war." And although there's an inkling of truth to that, Harriet Beecher Stowe did not start the Civil War, but what her book does, at least on the surface of it, is it demonstrates just how immoral slavery was. So I'm going to be reading to you a section of something here that I have from the Gilderman webpage. It says here that nearly everyone agrees that the reason for Uncle Tom's Cabin's initial influence was a matter of its timing. Its author, Harriet Beecher Stowe, was the perfect combination of magpie, shrewd political operator, and a grieving mother. After the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, and we mentioned that Slave Act, it was part of the Compromise of 1850, but after the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, the time was right for an anti-slavery novel, and Stowe wrote one, though she claimed later that God himself held the pen. But Stowe's beliefs about slavery's effects on family did not simply manifest themselves in a fictional story. The brutal facts of slavery did not automatically translate themselves into an effective political tract. The reading public may have been primed and ready for the right anti-slavery story to come along and simply touch a nerve or strike a chord. But why was this novel the right story? Well, as we have seen over the last couple of lectures, slavery is a major issue, and the abolitionist movement is growing in the North, and the tensions that slavery is creating really helps the Harriet Beecher Stowe novel to become something that everyone wants to talk about, right? It's banned in the South, and even that own action creates discourse, and it's eaten up in major ways in the North. So, for example, Continuing on with Gilderman.org, it says, sales and readership figures demonstrate Uncle Tom's Cabin's popular appeal. Readership of the National Era jumped from 17,000 to 28,000, and by the way, the National Era was a magazine. So readership of that magazine jumped from 17,000 to 28,000 during the story's serialization. On March 20th, 1852, John J. Jewett and Company published the first one-volume edition of Uncle Tom's Cabin and sold 5,000 copies in 2 days. Over 100,000 copies were sold by the end of the summer and 300,000 by March 1853. One Southern literary critic credited new technology for the novel's sales figures, which relied on steam presses, steamships, and steam carriages, iron roads, electric telegraphs, and universal peace among the reading nations of the earth. And indeed, the Industrial Revolution probably did help in being able to distribute and mass distribute and open up to a larger market Uncle Tom's Cabin. But the subject matter was itself incredibly important. It had literary significance. It had political significance. It had economic significance. It had all different types of importance. Okay? But as this slide states, immediately after its publication, Uncle Tom's Cabin was both lauded as an achievement and attacked as inaccurate. Now, I will say this. Harriet Beecher Stowe, as I understand it, was writing about a slave named Uncle Tom, and a series of other slaves as well, including one fantastic character named Topsy. But her stories are, in some ways, historical fiction. It is based on real events, slavery, but she, as I understand it, had never actually seen a slave plantation. And so she doesn't necessarily have first-hand, information about what slave life is like. So the picture that she portrays is not always accurate. In fact, the term Uncle Tom is a term that is meant or used to describe a slave or a person of color who tries to, how do you put this? Who tries to just be sort of a yes man to white people. Someone who is willing to just sort of accept their condition and just do what is expected of them almost willingly. And the image of slaves as just willingly accepting their fate, and they just do what they had to do, and they did so with a smile on their face, that idea is a dangerous one because it's not accurate. Slaves quite frequently sabotaged crops and quite frequently engaged in revolts and did things to really maintain their humanity in a system that completely dehumanized them. So in a way, the central figure in Uncle Tom's Cabin sort of reinforces a stereotype about slaves as being complacent and compliant, and that's one thing that we might say even to this day is somewhat problematic. But here's a couple of ways in which people responded to it. It says the most liberal abolitionists felt the book was not strong enough in its call to immediately end slavery. Okay, it disliked Stowe's tacit support of the colonization movement, and if you're not familiar with that is, it's basically the idea that you end slavery, right? We don't want slavery in the United States, but we also don't want black people to be integrated into society on an equal playing field. So we're basically going to colonize them in some other remote land someplace and let them be free among their own kind. And of course, this idea is found in Uncle Tom's Cabin, and Harriet Beecher Stowe isn't the only one to support this. Okay, but liberal abolitionists said, hey, that's a problem. And they suggested that Stowe's main character, Tom, was not forceful enough. And again, this is that idea that he was complacent, compliant, and he did so with a smile on his face. So liberal abolitionists were somewhat critical of the text. Moves on. More moderate anti-slavery advocates and reformers praised the book for putting a human face on those held in slavery, emphasizing the impact slavery had on families and helping the public understand and empathize with the plight of enslaved mothers. So if you were not as much of an extreme abolitionist, then Uncle Tom's Cabin definitely is something that you would have supported. It demonstrates and highlights the immorality of slavery. It begins to paint it in terms of a sin and its moral or immoral condition. And so, yeah, it would make sense that anti-slavery folks, more moderate folks, would accept the book. Obviously, pro-slavery forces claim that slavery was sanctioned in the Bible, that Uncle Tom was too noble, and accused Stowe of fabricating unrealistic, one-sided images of Southern slavery. And this is not my attempt to defend slavery, because it's a horrible institution. It should have been done away with long before this point. But they're not necessarily inaccurate in that Harriet Beecher Stowe isn't necessarily portraying the most accurate version of what slave life or plantation life was like. And again, I say that largely because she hadn't necessarily lived in that or seen that firsthand. That said, her book is incredibly significant. This text was co-opted by theater groups. It found its way in a number of different countries, including England. And I think it's rightfully to say that Uncle Tom's Cabin played a significant role in the discourses and in the move towards the Civil War. So, like so many of the other things that we have mentioned in this class, Uncle Tom's Cabin sits right there with some of the more central causes, because here people began to think about slavery in different ways. They began to become more, attuned to the horrors of slavery, not just its political and economic position, but now its moral positions as well. So there's Uncle Tom's Cabin. Feel free to read it. It's a bit of a lengthy text, but it's definitely one that has stood the test of time in many ways. So, all right, let's move on to the next item on our agenda, and that's going to be the Dred Scott decision, the Dred Scott choice, the Supreme Court Dred Scott case. All right, so basically what you got during a number of different presidencies, this case was going on. Eventually, the Supreme Court would rule on the Dred Scott case during Buchanan's administration, and Abraham Lincoln is going to use the Dred Scott case to campaign with when he seeks to run for the Illinois Senate in 1858, I think it was. But we'll get to that in a second. But let me give you the nuts and bolts of what the Dred Scott case is. So you have a gentleman, his name is Dred Scott. He was a slave, and it says here Dred Scott was a slave of an army surgeon named John Emerson. Well, basically what happens is that John Emerson takes Dred Scott from a slaveholding state and takes him above the 3630 parallel line, which was put into place by the Missouri Compromise, and takes Dred Scott into a non-slave holding state. As it states here, Scott had been taken from Missouri to posts in Illinois and what is now Minnesota for several years in the 1830s before returning to Missouri. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 had declared that area, including Minnesota, was a free area. So what happens is when John Emerson dies, Dred Scott is encouraged by his wife to sue for his freedom on the grounds that he had been taken and had resided into a state where slavery was not permitted. And as a result, he was therefore free. He was no longer to be a slave because he had been taken out of slavery into a state of freedom. So in 1846, Scott sued for his freedom on the grounds that he had lived in a free state and a free territory for a prolonged period of time. And again, this null and voided his position as a slave. Well, the interesting thing about the Dred Scott case is that initially, the lowest court that he goes to, the very first court, says, yeah, you're right, you gain your freedom. But of course, any good lawyer is going to immediately appeal the case, and his case ultimately gets appealed so high that it eventually gets to the Supreme Court. And about 11 years after his first rendering, his case got to the Supreme Court. And it says here that at stake were answers to critical questions, including slavery in the territories and citizenship of African Americans. It says the verdict was a bombshell. Okay? Basically speaking, the decision rendered in the Dred Scott case was basically this: once a slave, always a slave. If you were a slave in Missouri, you're going to be a slave in Minnesota, you're going to be a slave in California. It matters not. And the reason why you are a slave, if you are a black person who had been born a slave or brought into the United States as a slave, is because you do not have citizenship. Okay? And the Dred Scott case pretty much null and voided the idea of popular sovereignty. Okay, remember, popular sovereignty is this idea that a state can choose for themselves whether or not they will be slave or free, right? So let's go back to Nebraska in the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Nebraska said, we're not going to have slaves in our state. Well, what if John Emerson had wanted to take Dred Scott to Nebraska? Well, according to the Dred Scott case, well, if John Emerson had taken Dred Scott to Nebraska, then there would have been a slave in Nebraska, because even though Nebraska said under popular sovereignty they wouldn't have slaves, the Dred Scott case says, Dred Scott, you're a slave no matter where you are. Now, this, of course, just rocks Northerners, and especially abolitionists, because basically what the court has done is it's basically allowed for slavery to extend throughout any part of the country. In other words, the federal government, based upon the Dred Scott case, can't stop the spread of slavery anywhere. Okay? According to Tyndall, he writes, 8 of the 9 justices filed separate opinions. One concurred with Chief Justice Roger B. Taney of Maryland. By different lines of reasoning, 7 justices concluded that Scott was a slave. The aging Taney, who wrote the court's majority opinion, ruled that Scott lacked legal standing because he lacked citizenship. And you have to understand this. You cannot levy suit in court unless you are a citizen. And so basically, when we go all the way back to the very first case where Scott was given his freedom, Taney's going to argue that case never should have happened because, Scott, you were not a citizen and citizens can't sue. So therefore you weren't free in that moment and you will not be free. Taney argued that one became a U.S. citizen either by birth or by naturalization, and both of those methods ruled out any former slave. He then mistakenly argued that no state had ever accorded citizenship to blacks. In fact, that's not true. Tyndall continues to go on. At the time the Constitution was adopted, Taney further said, blacks, quote, had for more than a century been regarded as so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. So ultimately, the Dred Scott case null and voided popular sovereignty. You can't really reconcile those two issues. And when I have you watch the short video on the Lincoln-Douglas debates, you're going to see where Lincoln tries to get Senator Stephen Douglas to address this, because Stephen Douglas is a Democrat. The Democrats tended to support the Dred Scott case, but Stephen Douglas also was a supporter of popular sovereignty. But you can't hold on to popular sovereignty, which says we might have slavery, and hold on to the Dred Scott case, which says slavery must exist everywhere, because once a slave, always a slave, right? But you'll see that when I have you watch that video here in a second. Okay, let's move forward. Here on the left is an image of Dred Scott. It says the court ruled that Scott's sojourn of 2 years to Illinois and the Northwest Territory did not make him free once he returned to Missouri. Again, the rendering, you were a slave in Missouri, didn't matter where you went. It's kind of like if you get married in, New Hampshire, you're still going to be married in Nevada or Idaho or Kansas or where have you, right? The state recognizes your legal position as being married. Well, that's sort of what's going on here. If you're a slave in Missouri, then you're going to be a slave everywhere. It says the court further ruled that as a black man, Scott was excluded from United States citizenship and could not therefore bring suit. According to the opinion of the court, African Americans had not been part of the sovereign people who made the Constitution. The court also ruled that Congress never had the right to prohibit slavery in any territory. Any ban on slavery was a violation of the Fifth Amendment, which prohibited denying property rights without due process of law. So not only does the Dred Scott case say that once a slave, always a slave, it also states that really the United States doesn't have the right to end slavery anywhere unless somehow the Constitution is amended, because to prohibit slavery in any part of the country would be a violation of the Fifth Amendment. Okay? Therefore, the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional because it deprived Southerners of their property, quote-unquote property, if they wanted to go to Illinois. Okay? In the end, This decision rocked the United States. Okay, it says, by this decision, the Supreme Court had tried to settle a question that Congress had dodged ever since the Wilmot Proviso had resurfaced. But far from settling it, Taney's ruling had fanned the flames of dissension. Little wonder that Republicans protested the Dred Scott decision. The court had declared their anti-slavery program unconstitutional. And anyone who would be running under the Republican ticket would be seen as an abolitionist. And this is important because if you think back to the very beginning of my discourse on the causes of the Civil War, I made a distinction between abolitionism and anti-slavery. Abolitionists are like John Brown, right? They want to see slavery end. They want to see social and political equality. Anti-slavery folk, on the other hand, are content to let slavery exist where it is. They just don't want to see it spread. Well, Abraham Lincoln is probably more of an anti-slavery person, but because he's part of the Republican Party, many people who support the Dred Scott case would view Abraham Lincoln as nothing more than an abolitionist hell-bent, like John Brown, on ending slavery. And as we will see, that is not necessarily what Lincoln's position will be. Okay. All right, before I have you move on to the next slide, there's actually two short videos I want to have you watch. One is on the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and they're going to be talking about the Freeport Doctrine, and basically that has to deal with this issue of the Dred Scott case versus popular sovereignty. In 1850s, I believe it was 1858, 1857, Lincoln wants to run for the Senate in Illinois, and he is running on the Republican ticket. And defending his Senate seat is Senator Stephen Douglas. And so I want you to get a sense of what those debates were about. And those debates are really significant because they help make Lincoln somewhat of a known name. Up to this point, no one really knows who Lincoln is. He's a good itinerant lawyer, but he's had one little stint in Congress and he's a relatively nobody. And the Lincoln-Douglas debates, although Lincoln loses the senatorial race, which allows him to then be elected as president in 1860, these debates really help to propel him into popularity. Okay, so I'll have you watch that video, and then I also want to have you watch a video on John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. We mentioned John Brown last time when we talked about the Potawatomi massacre following the sack of Lawrence. But John Brown, an ardent abolitionist, he's going to attack a federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Ultimately, it will get him a quick drop, short stop. He will be hung and become a martyr for the abolitionists. So these are two additional events that we need to be aware of. So go ahead and watch those now and then move on to the next slide. All right, guys, now that you've watched both those videos, it is now time to get us right on the brink of what's going to cause the Civil War. And one of the main causes that some people, especially Southerners, would probably have regarded as a major issue was the election of 1860. That is, Abraham Lincoln becomes president of the United States. This was an election where the candidacies were largely divided. The Democratic Party was divided. There were all different groups of people. There was a number of people running, not just Lincoln, not just Douglas. You've got other people as well. You can see here Breckinridge, John Bell, all of whom running on the Northern Democrat ticket, Southern Democrat ticket, Constitutional Union, and Republican ticket. Now, the reason why you have so many different parties is because of the issues of slavery. You've got the issues of popular sovereignty. You've got Dred Scott. You've got all of these things that have caused Northern Democrats to split from Southern Democrats. And so you've got two different Democratic parties running. You've got disaffected groups of people who don't want to fit into either the Republican or Democratic Party, so they create the Constitutional Union. Here you can see the outcome of that. Lincoln obviously wins the electoral vote by a landslide. He gets 59% of the electoral vote, 180 votes. Okay. The popular vote, however, was less obvious. He gets 40% of the vote, but that's not a majority. Okay, and if you take a look at the map, you'll see that Lincoln doesn't gain a single vote in the South. That's not surprising. Okay, you saw the Lincoln-Douglas debates video. Lincoln is painted as the lover of the black man, that he is a staunch abolitionist, and indeed that's not what Lincoln is. Lincoln is not a man who immediately wants to see slavery completely be eradicated. Lincoln at one point says something to the effect of, slavery is an evil that we have to tolerate because it's constitutionally protected, right? Lincoln doesn't want to see slavery spread, but he's not necessarily saying that we need to abolish it, okay? But those in the South view Lincoln as nothing other than perhaps a John Brown abolitionist, and that's not the case. And that's important because once Lincoln is elected to the presidency in 1860, Southerners, starting with South Carolina, they begin to leave, or what we call secede from the Union. And the reason they do that is because they think Lincoln and the Republican Party are going to immediately end slavery. Okay? What's interesting is that Lincoln's name didn't appear on most of the ballots in the South. And so, they wouldn't have voted for him anyways, even if his name had been there. But his name wasn't even there. Okay? Let me give you a description of the election of 1860. Okay? States here, and I'm reading an article. It says, the Democrats met in Charleston, South Carolina in April 1860 to select their candidate for president in the upcoming election. It was turmoil. Northern Democrats felt that Stephen Douglas had the best chance to defeat the quote, unquote, black Republicans. Okay? Although an ardent supporter of slavery, Southern Democrats considered Douglas a traitor because of his support of popular sovereignty, which again permitted territories to choose not to have slavery. Now, this is why you have the Southern Democrats and the Northern Democrats, right? Because Stephen Douglas supports popular sovereignty, which could lead to a state not having slavery, Southern Democrats pull away from Douglas. Okay? It says Southern Democrats steamed out of the convention without choosing a candidate. 6 weeks later, the Northern Democrats chose Douglas, while at a separate convention, the Southern Democrats nominated then Vice President John C. Breckinridge. The Republicans, by contrast, met in Chicago that May and recognized that the Democrats' turmoil actually gave them a chance to take the election. Because you've got a split candidacy. You've got split vote here with the Democrats. The Republicans needed to select a candidate who could carry the North and win a majority of the Electoral College. To do that, the Republicans needed someone who could carry New Jersey, Illinois, Indiana, and Pennsylvania, 4 important states that remained uncertain. There were plenty of potential candidates, but in the end, Abraham Lincoln had emerged as the best choice. Lincoln had become the symbol of the frontier, hard work, the self-made man, and the American dream. His debates with Douglas, as you just watched, had made him a national figure, and the publication of those debates in early 1860 made him even better known. And in the end, Lincoln wins this election. And the election of 1860 is regarded as a central cause because once he's elected, and I mean almost immediately once he's elected, states begin to leave the Union, and they will do so beginning with South Carolina, who in December of 1860, before Lincoln even became president, they will secede from the Union, and a number of other states will follow. Okay? This is important to understand because once the Civil War begins, Lincoln is not fighting the war to end slavery. He is fighting the war to preserve the Union, to hold the country together. Why? Because the states have begun to secede. By February 1st, 1861, still before Lincoln took office, 6 more states left the Union. Okay? On February 7th, 1861, the 7 states met in Montgomery, Alabama, adopted a provisional constitution for the newly created Confederate States of America, and named a reluctant Jefferson Davis as president of the Confederate States. The states who created the Confederacy, and there will be others, by the way, who will join the Confederacy, including Virginia and Tennessee, but the states as of February 7th, 1861, were Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, and South Carolina. Eventually, again, you will get others, but they take a little bit longer to join the secession process. But remember, South Carolina had threatened secession even during Andrew Jackson's administration. Now, they did so over the Tariff of Abominations, right, which we talked about last week. But here, South Carolina is going to act first. And, it's not unsurprising that they would do so. They are the one state where they are actually outnumbered by the black population. There is actually 2 slaves for every white person in South Carolina. And so, that could those types of statistics, those types of numbers could really throw a wrench into South Carolinian society if slavery had been abrogated there. And so it's not uncommon. It's not surprising that South Carolina is really the state that continually moves first, whether it's with nullification or even with secession. But by the time that Lincoln takes the inaugural address, by the time he in fact becomes president, he is dealing with a really divided nation. And we don't just mean ideologically or philosophically, right? I mean, even in the 21st century, we can see that, there's been presidential elections where the people are divided, but not in the same way that Lincoln had to deal with a divided nation. I mean, he's quite literally dealing with a country that has broken apart, where on one side you've got the Union, and on the other side you've got this Confederacy, the Confederate States of America. And, it's insane. It's insane. It says, in all 7 deep South states, and I'm reading out of Tyndall's book, in all 7 deep South states, a solid majority had voted for secessionist delegates, but their combined vote would not have been a majority of the presidential vote in November. What happened, it seemed, was that often happens in revolutionary situations. A determined minority acted quickly in an emotionally charged climate and carried out its program over the weak objections of a confused and indecisive opposition. Okay. Does everyone in the South want to secede? No. But the roll, or the rock, the snowball, whatever you want to call it, began to roll down the hill. And once secession began, it was very difficult to stop. Okay. All right. Let's make Abraham Lincoln president, and then let's find out what the final last straw is that will inaugurate war. All right, so Lincoln becomes president-elect, and then on March 4th, 1861, he will take give his inauguration and give his inaugural address. It says his address was delivered to a divided nation, both physically and politically, and unlike any before him, the prospect of civil war and assassination were very real. And of course, as we know for Abraham Lincoln, both of those things will transpire. Indeed, I don't know of any other president whose administration was so overwhelmed by war. There's other presidents who were created by war, were defined by the wars that they presided over. You think of FDR in World War II, for example, or Woodrow Wilson in World War I. But quite literally, the entirety of Lincoln's administration has to do with war. And then in the end, although the Union will win, and I know I just gave it away, but although the Union will win, Lincoln will not survive this particular conflict. He will be assassinated. Tyndall writes the following. It says, during the 4 long months between Lincoln's election in November 1860 and his inauguration in March 1861, Lincoln said little about future policies and less about past positions. Quote, if I thought a repetition would do any good, I would make it, he wrote to an editor in St. Louis, but my judgment is that it would do positive harm. The secessionists, per se, believing that they had alarmed me, would clamor all the louder. So Lincoln stayed in Illinois until mid-February 1861, biding his time. He then boarded a train for a long, roundabout trip to Washington, D.C., and began to discuss his shifting outlook along the way. He told the New Jersey legislature that he was, quote, devoted to peace, but warned that it may be necessary to put the foot down. At the end of the journey, reluctantly yielding to rumors of plots against his life, he passed unnoticed on a night train through Baltimore and slipped into Washington before daybreak on February 23, 1861. Now, as I've already mentioned, Lincoln, his going to war, at least initially, the start, has nothing to do with slavery. his going to war has to do with holding the Union together. It eventually becomes about slavery. And when we talk about the Civil War itself, I'll be speaking more about that. But just recognize that at the start, Lincoln is not going to go to war because he wants to free slaves. That's not what it's about. But it becomes about that later on. So what I want to do is I want to take a look at Lincoln's inaugural address, at least a portion of it. We're not going to have time to look at the whole thing, but at least a portion of it to sort of get a sense of what Lincoln thinks and understanding what he thinks helps us, I believe, to understand the conflict itself a bit better and in more nuanced ways. All right, it states here that the day of his inaugural address, Lincoln tried to soothe tensions over, if that was at all possible, right? I'm not sure it was, but he attempts to do so. And he tries to provide a very clear point about his position with respects to slavery. Because remember, the reason why the South has seceded in large measure is because they believed Lincoln to be nothing but an ardent John Brown style abolitionist, right? He's part of what many Southerners call the Black Republican Party, right? And the reason why they call it that is because they think that the Republican Party is simply doing the will of the abolitionists, that the only platform that they have is abolition. And Lincoln's trying to make it clear that he is not an abolitionist in the John Brown sort of way. He says, quote, "I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so." Now, note what he doesn't say. He's not saying that he has no right to end it in other places, right? He's saying in the states where it exists. So he's speaking directly to that Southern Confederacy. He's speaking directly to those states who have claimed secession. He says, look, I have no purpose in any way possible to interfere with slavery in South Carolina. I'm not going to stop or halt slavery in Texas. I'm not going to meddle with slavery in Alabama. I have no right to do so, and I have no desire to do so. And I think we forget that Lincoln makes comments like this. I mean, one other thing that Lincoln says, he says, look, if I can hold the Union together by freeing every single slave, then that's what I will do. But if I can hold the Union together by freeing absolutely no one, then that's what I will do. Lincoln's point is not to free the slaves. But Southerners and those in the Confederacy weren't listening to him. It says, by March 4th, slavery was no longer the central issue. Instead, the focus had shifted to secession and the Union, and it was to this that Lincoln most deliberately spoke to when he gave his inaugural address. And so we're going to read through some of this address, and what you're going to find is that Lincoln is not talking about slavery. He's talking about the Union. Okay, and what the Union means and how he understands the Union and what his obligations are. Okay, so let's take a look at that address now. All right, part of his address, Lincoln's going to provide for you an overview of his understanding of what the Union is. And I'll give you the punchline. According to Lincoln, the Union has not been dissolved. That is, the states who are claiming to have left the Union, to have seceded, haven't in fact left. And the reason is because the Union is perpetual and it is perfect, and the states cannot, on their own mere whim, leave the Union. Okay? So he's going to give you an example, or at least he's going to give you a bit of a history lesson. I would argue that it's not a really good history lesson, but he's going to give you one here. He says, quote, "We find the proposition that in legal contemplation the Union is perpetual, confirmed by the history of the Union itself." In other words, the Union proves that the Union is perpetual. That's his argument here. Okay? He says the Union is much older than the Constitution. It was formed, in fact, by the Articles of Association in 1774. Now, the one thing I would say about this particular argument that Lincoln is making is that in 1774, there wasn't even a United States. We were still British subjects at that point, colonies to England in 1774. So one might take a little argument here with Lincoln's argument to say that, you know, the Union is much older than the actual Constitution, which created it. He says it was later matured and continued by the Declaration of Independence in 1776. Now, if you read the Declaration of Independence, nowhere in there does it talk about the creation of a union or the development of a union. So again, I would take issue with this argument. He goes on to state, it was further matured, and the faith of all the then 13 states expressly plighted and engaged that it should be perpetual by the Articles of Confederation in 1778. I would point out here that they don't call themselves a union with the Articles of Confederation. They call themselves a confederacy, a confederation. And then finally, he says in 1787, one of the declared objects for ordaining and establishing the Constitution was, quote, to form a more perfect union. And indeed, he's not wrong here. However, one thing I would argue is, what did the founders mean by the word union? Did they mean perpetual union? Did they mean a loose leaf union? What kind of union are they speaking about? Because one of the things I think is quite true is that for the Southerner, if they didn't think that they could get out of the Union, I highly doubt that many of the Southern states would have joined it with the understanding that they couldn't ever get out. So I take a little bit of issue with Lincoln here in his history lesson, but the point of reading this is less to deconstruct this and assess it as it is to highlight the way that Lincoln thinks. Lincoln thinks that the Union is not broken. He says, look, the Union is perpetual. It does not end. It is forever. It is perfect. And it is so even before the Constitution of the United States created it. We as a people, our history, our legacy is one of a perpetual, perfect union. And therefore the states cannot leave. Okay, let's continue on. He says, but if destruction of the Union by one or by a part only of the states be lawfully possible, the Union is less perfect than before the Constitution, having lost the vital element of perpetuity. It follows from these views that no state upon its own mere motion can lawfully get out of the Union, that resolves and ordinances to that effect are legally void, and that acts of violence within any state or states against the authority of the U.S. are insurrectionary or revolutionary according to circumstances. In other words, Lincoln says, look, it doesn't matter what resolutions you put forward. It doesn't matter what ordinances South Carolina decided to pass. These things have no legal standing. You can sit here and say all day long, Texas, that you have seceded from the Union, but you haven't, because the Union is perpetual. And if you choose to do anything, any act of violence, anything that might challenge the authority of the United States, then those actions are revolutionary. They are not the actions of a sovereign country. Okay. Now, of course, if you were to speak to Texas or Alabama or South Carolina or Florida or who have you, right, they would completely disagree with this perspective. And this is what makes the Civil War interesting, because when we understand that the way Lincoln thinks about the war and the way that the South thinks about the war, you begin to see a more nuanced and complex picture, right? The South believes they have every right to leave. This is evidenced by the fact that they said they left. Lincoln, on the other hand, says, no, 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 no. You are not a sovereign nation. You have not left. You are simply rebelling, okay? You are out of your proper relationship with the United States, right? And, you know, as far as Lincoln is concerned, Texas is still a state of the Union. South Carolina is still a state of the Union. The Confederate States of America don't, in fact, exist in the way that the United States exists. That you have that type of behavior going on in the South, as far as Lincoln goes, is insurrectionary and it's revolutionary. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. And it's important that we understand these differences, because once we know how each side is viewing the conflict, we begin to understand why Southerners may have viewed this as the War of Northern Aggression, right? The South was invaded by the North, while on the other hand, Lincoln views this as a noble act as a president who's simply trying to hold the Union together. The Civil War is not so clear-cut. It's not just about a bunch of Northerners who hated slavery and wanted equality with blacks against Southerners who wanted, you know, nothing to do with anything but slavery, right? That's not an accurate picture. What you have is an issue of states' rights. There are many people in the South who didn't like secession. There are people in the South who aren't necessarily hell-bent on slavery. And, of course, the same could be true about the North. There are people who are pro-slavery in the North. And be quite clear on this as well. Every state that had slaves didn't necessarily secede from the Union. Missouri and Kentucky, both of whom were border states throughout the entire war, they had slaves, but they did not secede from the Union. So we must recognize that much of the narrative that we are taught in junior high and high school, I think, is a little oversimplified, and we need these nuances to really understand what's going on. All right, let's move on. It states here that Lincoln's adherence to the premise that the Union could not be dissolved by secession made a point which would direct his overall understanding of the conflict. This was his understanding. The states were not in rebellion, but rather the people of those states were in rebellion, and as commander-in-chief, he had all power to suppress any internal display of rebellion. You see, as far as Lincoln was concerned, the states and the people were two separate things. It's not that South Carolina was in a state of rebellion. It's that the people inside the state, the people of the state, were in rebellion. And the state belonged to the United States, and as a result, the people who lived there, the people who were citizens of the United States, they were acting out. Okay? That's important to understand. Lincoln goes on to state, quote, "I therefore consider that in view of the Constitution and the laws, the Union is unbroken, and to the extent of my ability, I shall take care, as the Constitution itself expressly enjoins upon me, that the laws of the Union be faithfully executed in all the states." Okay? I will, as President of the United States, according to Lincoln, do what it is that I have to do to ensure that the states who are claiming secession fall in line, because indeed the Union, as far as Lincoln is concerned, is not broken. All right? I know I sound like a broken record repeating that over and over again, but just want to make sure we got that. Okay? All right, let's finish up this address. All right, in closing, Lincoln says this: "There will be no invasion, no using of force against or among the people anywhere." Now, I want to caveat this and digress just a second, because if you recall, I had mentioned earlier that at one point, before he takes his inaugural address, Lincoln states that we are devoted to peace, but that it might be necessary to put the foot down. Now, Lincoln states that before he says there will be no invasion, no using of force. So the question is, what's Lincoln's position? Does he think force is going to be coming? Does he believe war is going to be had? Well, he says later on in this inaugural address, he says, "You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors." So the question that I don't have a good answer to, because I don't have any evidence to support it, but the question that I think we might ask is, does Lincoln expect a war? Does Lincoln want a war? I don't think Lincoln wants the Civil War. I don't think he wants what eventually happened. By no means do I think that's Lincoln's desire, his intentions, or his hopes or objectives. But he says earlier it might be necessary to put the foot down. What does that mean? When he says you can have no conflict without yourselves being the aggressors, does that mean if the South throws the first punch, then Lincoln will respond with another punch? What does all that mean? The South will throw the first punch, but in some ways, Lincoln provoked that first punch. And so it's not quite clear what's going on here. But Lincoln says there will be no invasion. He says, "You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government, while I shall have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it." "I am loath to close," Lincoln says. "We are not enemies." Indeed they were, but friends, highly doubtful. "We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the course of the Union, when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature." And he ends his inaugural address in that way. Now, following this inauguration, in fact, the next day, on March 5th, 1861, the day after Lincoln took office, Lincoln gains some information about a fort which was located in South Carolina, and he is given information about a fort known as Fort Sumter. This is a replica of what Fort Sumter looked like. It's in Charleston Harbor, excuse me, and he is told that Fort Sumter is getting low on supplies. This is a federal garrison. It's getting low. According to Tyndall, Major Robert Anderson, in charge of Fort Sumter, had enough supplies for only a month to 6 weeks, and the Confederates were beginning to encircle the fort with a ring of fire. In other words, South Carolinians are beginning to place cannon around Fort Sumter. Now, Lincoln has to make a choice. What do you do with Fort Sumter? There's clearly not enough supplies in the fort to supply the men with the things that they need. Major Robert Anderson says, we can hold out for about 6 weeks. So what do you do? Tyndall goes on. He says, on April 4th, 1861, Lincoln decided to resupply the 69 men at Fort Sumter. On April 9th, President Jefferson Davis of the Confederacy and his Confederate cabinet decided to oppose any effort to supply the fort. Okay, so Lincoln, believing the fort belonging to the United States, and in every way it does, believing that South Carolina had not seceded, is going to look at this ring of fire of cannon that it's encircling the fort as insurrectionary, as revolutionary. And he's going to say, look, we have to do something about this. We're going to resupply the fort. Jefferson Davis says, no. If you do that, there will be nasty consequences. Okay. On April 11th, the Confederate general, a gentleman by the name of Pierre G.T. Beauregard, also known as P.G.T. Beauregard, a dapper Louisiana Creole who had studied the use of artillery under Robert Anderson. And by the way, Robert Anderson is the officer in charge of Fort Sumter. So what you've got is Robert Anderson is inside the fort, and his one-time student, P.G.T. Beauregard, who Anderson taught artillery to, is now going to ultimately fire upon Fort Sumter. So the student is going to wage war against the teacher. Okay. So for those of you out there, please don't get any fun ideas. All right. Okay. It goes on here. It says, P.G.T. Beauregard demanded a speedy surrender of Fort Sumter. Anderson refused, and at 4:30 on April 12th, Fort Sumter was attacked. This is a shot of what Fort Sumter looked like after the bombardment. Okay. Now, there were no casualties except for one Confederate horse. I apologize. Lots of horses died in the making of the Civil War, but not of this lecture. I killed no horses or any animals or anything, for that matter, in the making of this lecture. I killed some time, but not any horses. Okay, that was a bad joke. I apologize. But the attack on Fort Sumter, the question is, well, who's at fault? Is it the Confederacy? Was it P.G.T. Beauregard who, ordered the first shot to be fired? Or is it the Union's fault for, in some ways, forcing the hand of the Confederacy by resupplying Fort Sumter? It says the guns of Charleston signaled the end of the waiting game. The attack on Fort Sumter basically was the last straw. It inaugurates civil war. Okay? It is that last final cause. This is an additional image of Fort Sumter. Okay? 30 hours. For 30 hours, the Confederacy bombarded Fort Sumter. And Anderson couldn't really do anything about it. He just sat there and waited the thing out. And in the end, it will be surrendered. And civil war will begin. Okay? All right, guys, that should at least give you a sense of what some of the major causes were which brought about the war. Obviously, over the next couple of weeks, we'll be talking about the war itself. But if you have questions on the causes, please let me know, and I'd be happy to address them. All right, guys? So with that, as always, go in peace. Be warm and filled. May the force be with you. Live long and prosper, and may the odds forever be in your favor. Have a blessed week, guys.